Alright, there's sound. There's a cat going crazy to my left. That'll do as a bookmark, I guess. Which is this? That'll do. Alright. So, today we'll start reading Julius Caesar's The Gallic War, translated by Carolyn Hammond. I'm going to jump right into it, skip the introduction. Because why would we want to do the introduction? Alright. Alrighty. So the first book, 58 BC, AUC 696, consuls Lucius Calpurnius Piso, Caesonius, Aulus Gabinius. Here we go with the Latin names. All right. War against the Helvetii, Arovistus, and the Germans. 1. The whole of Gaul is divided into 3 parts, one of which the Belgae inhabit, the Aquitani another, and the third a people who in their own language are called Celts, but in ours Gauls. They all differ among themselves in respect of language, way of life, and laws. The river Garonne divides the Gauls from the Aquitani, and the Marne and Seine rivers separate them from the Belgae. Of these 3, the Belgae are the bravest, for they are furthest away from the civilization and culture of the province. Merchants very rarely travel to them, or import such goods as make men's courage weak and womanish. They live, moreover, in close proximity to the Germans, who inhabit the land across the Rhine, and they are continually at war with them. For this reason, the Helvetii also exceed the other Gauls in bravery, because they are embroiled in almost daily battles with the Germans, either when they are warding them off from their own frontiers, or when they themselves take the fight into enemy territory. The land which the Gauls are said to occupy begins at the river Rhone, and is bounded by the Garonne, the ocean, and the territory of the Belgae. The part of it inhabited by the Sequani and the Helvetii reaches to the Rhine. This land has one frontier to the north. The Belgae come from the most distant regions of Gaul. Their lands extend to the lower part of the Rhine, facing north and east. Aquitania reaches from the Garonne to the Pyrenees, and that part of the ocean nearest Spain. It faces northwest. 2. Among the Helvetii, by far the most aristocratic and richest man was Orgetorix. During the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Pupius Piso, his desire to become king led him to start a conspiracy among the aristocracy, and he persuaded all the citizens to leave their land in full force. It would be perfectly simple, he said, to win power over the whole of Gaul. So superior were they in courage to all the rest. He persuaded them the more easily because the Helvetii are hemmed in on all sides by the natural terrain. On one side by the Rhine, which is very broad and deep, and separates the land of the Helvetii from the Germans, on another by the heights of the Jura mountain range, which stands between them and the Sequani, and thirdly by Lake Lemanus and by the Rhone, which separates them from our province. As a consequence, their freedom of movement was constrained. Their ability to wage war against their neighbors was also impaired. As they were so fond of waging war, this made the Helvetii very resentful. In comparison with the size of their population, their glorious reputation in war, and their courage, they considered their territory too restricted. It was 220 miles from north to south and 165 from east to west. 3. Mindful of these considerations, and at Orgetorix's instigation, the Helvetii decided to get ready everything they thought was needed for a migration, buy up as many pack animals and wagons as they could, sow as much seed as possible to ensure a supply of corn on the journey, and to establish peaceful relations with neighboring states. They considered that 2 years would suffice for these preparations, and passed a law establishing their decision to migrate in the 3rd year. Orgetorix was put in charge of organizing the migration, and of his own accord he undertook an embassy to the Gallic states, Whilst on his travels, he persuaded one of the Sequani called Casticus, the son of Catamantaleotis, who had held the kingship over the Sequani for many years and been named a friend of the Roman people by the Senate, to seize the kingship in his own state, which his father had previously held. At the same time, he persuaded an Aeduan called Dumnorix to do likewise. Dumnorix's brother, Divicus, was at the time chief magistrate of the Aedui and a very popular ruler. Orgetorix also gave Dumnorix his daughter in marriage. He assured Dumnorix and Casticus that they would achieve their object with ease, especially since he would himself be seizing power among the Helvetii, who were beyond doubt the strongest of the Gallic peoples. And he promised them that he would use his strength and his army to help them win their kingdoms. They were persuaded by his words, exchanged guarantees, and swore an oath, hoping that, once they had become kings, through these three very powerful and determined peoples, they could seize control of all of Gaul. 4. News of this plot came to the Helvetii through informers. In accordance with custom, they made Orgetorix plead his defense in chains. If found guilty, the law required that he be burned alive. On the day appointed for the trial, Orgetorix summoned to the court a whole gang of dependents from all directions, about 10,000 in number, and he assembled likewise all his main retainers and debtors. By their help he escaped trial, while the citizens, angry at his escape, were trying to pursue the case by force of arms, and the magistrates were mustering a crowd of men from the surrounding countryside. Orgetorix died, and not without the suspicion, according to the Helvetii, that it was by his own hand. 5. After his death, the Helvetii none the less tried to put their previous decision into action by emigrating from their own land. As soon as they considered that they were ready for the enterprise, they set fire to all their own towns, about 12 in number, and to about 400 villages, as well as all their private buildings. All the corn, except that what they were to carry with them, they reduced to ashes. So once the hope of returning home was removed, they would be the more ready to undergo dangers of all kinds. They ordered each man to bring from his home 3 months' supply of corn ready to ground for himself. They persuaded the Raurici, the Tulingi, and the Ladovici, who were their neighbors, to adopt the same plan. Once all their towns and villages were burned down too, they set out together. The Helvetii also welcomed the boy, who had lived across the Rhine and had crossed into the territory of Noricum and besieged the town of Noria, and made alliance with them. 6. There were only 2 possible routes for the departure from their home. One went through the land of the Sequani, between the Jura mountain range and the Rhone. It was narrow and difficult, so that the wagons could hardly pass in single file, and the high mountain which loomed over it meant that a handful of men could easily block the pass. The other, which went through our province, was far quicker and easier, because the Rhone, which flows between the lands of the Helvetii and those of the Allobroges, who had recently been pacified, can be forded at several points. The furthermost town of Allobroges, on the border of the Helvetii in Geneva. A bridge connects the town with the Helvetii, who reckoned they could either persuade the Allobroges to allow them passage through their land, for they did not as yet appear to be reconciled to the Roman people, or force them to do so. Once everything was ready for the migration, the Helvetii fixed a date by which everyone was to assemble by the banks of the Rhone. The date was the 28th of March, in the consulship of Lucius Piso and Aulus Gabinius. 7. When news came to Caesar that the Helvetii were trying to journey through our province, he hurried his departure from Rome, and by the longest forced march possible he made for Transalpine Gaul and reached Geneva. He ordered the whole province to supply as many men as possible, for in Transalpine Gaul there was only 1 legion, and gave orders for the bridge at Geneva to be destroyed. When the Helvetii heard of his arrival, they sent their most aristocratic citizens to him as envoys, headed by Nemeus and Veroclodius, to explain their intention of marching without doing any harm through the province, for they had no other route. They asked his agreement to their action. Caesar remembered how the consul Lucius Cassius had been killed and his army beaten by the Helvetii and sent under the yoke, and decided to refuse. Nor did he believe that these men, hostile as they were, would refrain from doing harm and damage if allowed to march through the province. Even so, he told the envoys that he would take a while to consider, and that they should, if they so wished, return on 13th of April. Thus a space of time would elapse in which the soldiers he had ordered could muster. 8. Meanwhile, he used the legion he had with him and the soldiers who had assembled from the province to construct a 16-foot rampart and a ditch from Lake Lemanus, which flows into the Rhone, to the Jura Mountains, which form the border between the Sequani and the Helvetii, a distance of over 17 miles. When the work was finished, he located garrisons and fortified outposts. If the Helvetii tried to cross without permission, he could then restrain them more easily. When the day which he had agreed with the envoys came, and they returned to him, he said that in accordance with the practice and precedent of the Roman people, he was unable to grant anyone access through the province, and he made it clear that he would stop them if they tried to use force. Their hopes were crushed. Some of the Helvetii lashed boats together and made a number of rafts. Others tried to break across the fording places of the Rhone, where the river was at its shallowest, partly in the daytime, but mostly at night. They abandoned these efforts, forced back by the defense works, the attacks of the soldiers, and by missiles. 9. Only one way remained, through the land of the Sequani, because it was so narrow they could not take this route without the Sequani's consent. When the Helvetii themselves failed to win the Sequani's agreement, they sent envoys to Dumnorix the Aeduan, hoping that he could intercede and sway the Sequani. Because of his popularity and open-handed generosity, Dumnorix was extremely powerful among the Sequani. He was also a friend to the Helvetii, for it was from them that he had taken a wife, Orgetorix's daughter. Spurred on by his eagerness to be king, Dumnorix supported revolution. He also wanted, by services rendered, to put as many states as possible under an obligation to him. So he undertook the negotiations and asked the Sequani to let the Helvetii go through their territory, and he arranged for them to exchange hostages. The Sequani pledged themselves not to hinder the Helvetii on their journey, while the Helvetii promised not to do any harm or damage as they were passing through. 10. News came to Caesar that the Helvetii planned to march through the lands of the Sequani and the Aedui into the territory of the Santones, which is not far from that of the Tolsates, as state actually in the province. If they succeeded, he knew that it would pose a serious threat to the province to have this warlike nation, which was hostile to the Roman people, so close to such important and completely unprotected corn-producing areas. So he put his legate, Titus Labienus, in charge of the defense works which he had constructed, and set out by forced march for Italy, where he enlisted 2 legions and mobilized 3 more which had been wintering near Aquileia. He then hastened back by the shortest route over the Alps into Transalpine Gaul with these 5 legions. There the Sutrones, the Gracelli, and the Catariges had taken up position on some high ground and tried to hinder the army's march. They were beaten in a series of encounters, after which in 7 days he marched from Osculum, the most distant town of Cisalpine Gaul, into the land of Vocati in the province. From there he led his army into the land of the Allobroges, and from there to that of the Segusiavi. These are the nearest peoples to the Rhone outside the province. 11. The Helvetii had already brought their forces through the narrow pass in the land of the Sequani, and had reached the country of the Aedui, which they were pillaging. When the Aedui were unable to protect either themselves or their possessions from the Helvetii, they sent envoys to Caesar to ask for help. They had always behaved well, they said, towards the Roman people, so that they hardly deserved to have their land laid waste, their children enslaved, and their towns stormed almost under the gaze of our army. At the same time, the Aedui Ambari, who were relations and kinsmen of the Aedui, informed Caesar that their land too was being laid waste, and that they were having difficulty in protecting their towns from the enemy attack. Likewise, the Allobroges, who had dwellings and property across the Rhone, fled to Caesar, claiming that everything but their land had been taken from them. For these reasons, Caesar decided not to wait until the property of Rome's allies was destroyed and the Helvetii had reached the territory of the Santones. 12. There is a river called the Saone, which flows through the lands of the Aedui and the Sequani into the Rhone so very slowly that it is impossible to tell just by looking in which direction it is flowing. The Helvetii crossed it by lashing rafts and boats together. When Caesar learned from his scouts that the Helvetii had brought 3/4 of their forces across, and that about a quarter was left on the near bank of the Saone during the third watch, he set out from camp with 3 legions, and made for that section of their forces which had not yet crossed. He attacked when they were encumbered with baggage and off guard, and killed a great number. The rest fled and hid in nearby woods. The section consisted of men known as Tigurini after their district. The whole state of the Helvetii is divided into 4 such districts. In the time of our fathers, the Tigurini had migrated on their own. They had killed the consul Lucius Cassius and sent his army under the yoke. So whether by chance or by the gods' design, that section of the Helvetian state, which had once inflicted an infamous defeat on the Roman people, was also the first to pay the penalty. In doing so, Caesar avenged not only a national but also a private injury, for the grandfather of his father-in-law, Lucius Piso, was a legate, also called Lucius Piso, killed by the Tigurini in the same battle as Cassius. 13. After the battle, he had a bridge built over the Saone and led his army across it to pursue the Helvetii. They were thrown into confusion by his unexpected arrival, and when they learned that he had taken only a day to cross the river, a task which had taken them 20 days, and then with extreme difficulty, they sent envoys to him. The embassy was headed by Divico, who had led the Helvetii in the war against Cassius. He spoke with Caesar to this effect: if the Roman people made peace with the Helvetii, they would go to whatever region Caesar decided, and stay wherever he wished them to remain. If, however, he continued to pursue them with war, he should remember both the former misfortunes of the Roman people and the ancient bravery of the Helvetii. He had attacked a single section of their people unexpectedly, at a time when those who had crossed the river could not come to the assistance of their fellows, and so for this reason he ought not to attribute too much to his own bravery, nor should he treat them with contempt. The Helvetii had learned from their fathers and their forefathers to fight with courage rather than cunning or treachery, and so Caesar should not allow the place where they were holding talks to win fame or future renown because of a disaster for the Roman people and the massacre of an army. 14. Caesar replied to the envoys as follows: since he remembered those past events which the envoys had mentioned, he was therefore in no doubt, and indeed he was all the more indignant because that previous defeat had happened through no fault of the Roman people. If its army had at that time been aware of having committed some wrongdoing, it would have been a simple matter to take precautions, but the Roman army had been taken unawares precisely because it did not think it had done anything which gave it cause to be afraid, and so considered it inappropriate to be anxious without good reason. Even if he were willing to forget this old injury, surely it was impossible to dismiss the remembrance of recent outrages, that against his will they had tried to march through the province by force, and that the Aedui and the Allobroges had all been attacked. As for their haughty boasting about their own victory, and their marveling that their outrages had gone so long unpunished, these pointed the same way. For the immortal gods usually allow those men they wish to punish for their crime a time of success and a period of impunity, so that when a change of fortune comes, they are all the more grieved by it. This being so, he would none the less still make peace with them, if they would surrender hostages to prove to him their willingness to fulfill their promises, and if they would make reparation to the Aedui for the harm done to them and their allies, and likewise to the Allobroges. Divico replied that from the time of their ancestors the Helvetii were more accustomed to receive hostages than to surrender them, and that the Roman people could witness to the fact. With this reply he departed. 15. The following day, the Helvetii struck camp and moved out of the area. So did Caesar, who sent all his cavalry ahead, 4,000 in number, recruited from all over the province and from the Agii and their allies, to see where the enemy was marching. But they pursued the rearguard too eagerly and joined battle with the Helveti's cavalry on unfavorable ground. A few of our men were killed. The Helvetii were elated by the engagement because they had routed such a large force of cavalry with only 500 horse. So they began at times to make a bolder stand and, with their rear guard, to provoke our men to fight. Caesar restrained his men from fighting, content for the time being to prevent the enemy from pillaging, foraging, and plundering. In this way they marched for about a fortnight, so that no more than 4 or 5 miles lay between the enemy rear guard and our vanguard. 16. Meanwhile, Caesar was daily demanding from the Agii the corn which had been promised by their government. For because of the cold, Gaul, as has already been said, lies to the north. Not only was the corn in the fields not yet ripe, but there was not even a sufficient supply of fodder. He was unable to use the corn which he had transported up the Saone by boat because the Helvetii had changed the direction of their march away from the river, and he did not want to lose contact with them. The Agii were fobbing him off from one day to the next. Their corn was being collected, they said. It was being transported. It was at hand. When he realized that he was being put off too long and that the time had arrived when the corn ought to be distributed to the men, he summoned the leaders of the Agii. Many of them were present in camp, including Divicius and Liscus, who held the highest magistracy of the Agii, which they called Vergobret. The Vergobret is annually appointed and has power of life and death over the citizens. Caesar reproached them severely for failing to offer assistance at such a pressing time, with the enemy so close at hand, when corn could neither be bought nor taken from the fields, and he complained with particular vehemence of having been abandoned, because it was in response to the pleas of a large number of them that he had undertaken this war in the first place. 17. Then at last Liscus was encouraged by Caesar's speech to reveal what he had previously concealed. There were certain men, he explained, who had particularly strong influence over the people, and who, in the private sphere, had more power than the magistrates. By their treacherous and wicked statements, these men were deterring the people from collecting the corn which they were obliged to provide. It was better, they thought, to submit to Gallic than to Roman rule. If at present they could not win supreme control of Gaul, nor did they doubt that the Romans, if they beat the Helvetii, would then snatch liberty from the Agii, together with the rest of Gaul. Lysias went on to say that they could not prevent these same men from relaying our plans and what was going on in the camp here to the enemy. Worse still, said Lysias, he knew that because he had been forced to report this urgent matter to Caesar, he had put himself in great danger, and it was for this reason that he kept silent as long as possible. 18. Caesar felt that Lysias' words pointed to Dumnorix, Divicus's brother, because, however, he was unwilling to have the matter discussed in public. He quickly dismissed the meeting, but kept Lysias back. When they were alone, he questioned him about what he had said at the meeting. Lysias answered more frankly and confidently. Caesar questioned other men in secret about the same matter. He found that it was true. Dumnorix was the man, highly audacious, extremely influential with the people, thanks to his open-handed generosity, and ambitious for revolution. For several years he had purchased at a low price the collection rights on river tolls and all of Agii's other taxes, not least because not a single person dared to bid against him. In this way he had increased his own property and obtained vast resources for the purposes of bribery. He maintained a large cavalry force at his own expense, which he always kept at his side. He had influence even among neighboring states as well as among the Agii. To consolidate this powerful position, he had given his mother in marriage to a powerful aristocrat of the Bituriges. He himself had taken a wife from among the Helvetii, and he used his maternal half-sister and other female relations to make marriage alliances with other states. Because of this connection, he was a strong supporter of the Helvetii, but he also hated Caesar and the Romans on his own account, because their coming had weakened his own power, while his brother Diviciacus had been restored to his old place of influence and respect. If something were to happen to the Romans, he entertained the highest hopes of winning the Aeduan kingship through the Helvetii, but the power of the Roman people made him despair not only of becoming king, but even of holding on to what influence he already possessed. As to the unsuccessful cavalry battle, which had taken place a few days previously, Caesar learned from these interrogations that the flight had been started by Dumnorix and his cavalry contingent, for Dumnorix was in command of the cavalry force sent by the Aedui to assist Caesar. The rest of the cavalry had been thrown into panic by their flight. 19. Weird. All this he knew, but then incontrovertible proof was added to his suspicions that Dumnorix had led the Helvetii through the land of the Sequani, that he had arranged for the exchange of hostages between the two, that he had done all this not only without the permission of Caesar or the Aedui, but even without the knowledge of either, and that he was being accused by a magistrate of the Aedui. Because of all this, Caesar thought he had good cause either for punishing Dumnorix himself or for ordering the Aedui to punish him. One consideration, however, acted as a counter to all these. He was familiar with the devotion of Dumnorix's brother, Diviciacus, to the Roman people, his great goodwill towards Caesar, his outstanding loyalty, his justice, his moderation. Caesar was afraid of upsetting Diviciacus, but by punishing Dumnorix. And so, before he attempted to resolve the matter, he gave orders for Diviciacus to be summoned. The regular interpreters were sent away, and he spoke with him through Gaius Valerius Procillus, a leader of the province of Gaul and a close friend of Caesar's, in whom he placed the highest confidence in all matters. At the time, Caesar reminded Diviciacus what had been said about Dumnorix in his presence at the Gallic assembly, and revealed what each man in turn had told him about Dumnorix. Caesar asked Diviciacus, indeed, he urged him not to be offended, but rather, when the matter was investigated, either to judge Dumnorix himself or to order the state to do so. 20. Diviciacus embraced Caesar in tears and began to plead with him not to judge harshly of his brother. He was aware that it was all true, and no one was more grieved by it than he. There was a time when he himself had considerable influence among the Aedui and in the rest of Gaul, while his brother Dumnorix, being so young, had very little and had risen by his help. This same brother was now using his strength and power not only to lessen Diviciacus's influence, but almost to destroy him. Even so, he felt the influence of brotherly affection and of public opinion, for if Dumnorix were punished by Caesar while he, Diviciacus, continued to hold a position of favor with him, no one would believe that the punishment was meted out against his wishes, and as a result the loyal of all Gaul would turn against him. As he pleaded with Caesar at length, he wept, but Caesar took him by the hand, comforted him, and told him to say no more, making it clear that his influence was valuable, and that because of his goodwill and his entreaties, Caesar would overlook both the harm done to the Republic and his own sense of indignation. Then in Diviciacus's presence, Caesar summoned Dumnorix and explained the grounds for complaint against him, setting out his own view and the state's reasons for protest. He warned Dumnorix to avoid any taint of suspicion in future, and ended by saying that he was overlooking the past for Diviciacus's sake. Then, to make sure he knew what Dumnorix was doing and with whom he spoke, Caesar put him under guard. 21. That same day, Caesar's scouts told him that the enemy was encamped in the foothills just over 7 miles from the Roman camp. He sent men to reconnoiter the hill and find out what sort of ascent there was on the other side of it. They reported back that it was an easy climb. During the third watch, Caesar ordered Titus Labienus, his second in command, to take 2 legions, follow those men who had spied out the way, and climbed to the summit, and he explained his plan. Then, during the last watch of the night, Caesar marched against the enemy along the same route that they had taken, sending all the cavalry on ahead. Publius Considius, who was considered a man of wide military skill and experience, and who had served in the armies of Lucius Sulla and later Marcus Crassus, was sent on ahead with the scouts. 22. By dawn, Labienus had taken possession of the summit. Caesar was little more than a mile from the enemy camp, and as he later learned from prisoners, the enemy had not been aware of his own arrival, or that of Labienus's either. But Considius galloped up to him and reported that the summit which Caesar had expected Labienus to be occupying was in enemy hands, also that he had recognized them by their Gallic weapons and emblems. So Caesar led his own men instead to a nearby hill and arranged his forces for battle. He had instructed Labienus not to give battle unless his own troops appeared near the enemy camp, so that the attack upon the enemy would come from all sides at once. And so once he was in control of the summit, Labienus prepared to wait for our men and avoided engaging. Only late in the day did Caesar at last discover from his scouts that the hill was being held by his own men, and that the Helvetii had moved camp, and that Considius had been so terrified that he had reported seeing what he had not in fact seen at all. The rest of that day Caesar followed the enemy at his usual distance and pitched his camp about 3 miles from theirs. 23. Next day, as only 2 more days remained before it was time to distribute the army's corn rations, and as he was no more than 16.5 miles from Bibracte, by far the greatest and wealthiest of Aeduan towns, he thought it time to make provision for the corn supply. So he shifted his march away from the Helvetii and set out for Bibracte. The enemy learned of this from some runaway slaves belonging to Lucius Aemilius, a squadron leader in charge of Caesar's Gallic cavalry, either because they thought the Romans were fleeing in fear from them, which seemed all the more likely as on the previous day they had not engaged despite seizing a vantage point, or because they were sure they could cut them off from their corn supply. The Helvetii changed plan, altered their course, and began to pursue and harass our rear guard. 24. When Caesar saw this, he withdrew his forces to the nearest hill and sent the cavalry to face the enemy assault. Meanwhile, he drew up a triple battle line, consisting of the 4 veteran legions halfway up the hill. On top of the height, he positioned the 2 legions he had recently recruited in Near Gaul, and all the auxiliaries, and filled the whole hill with men. Meanwhile, he gave orders for the soldiers' packs to be piled together in one place, and for those who were positioned in line higher up to stand guard there. The Helvetii followed with all their wagons and piled up their baggage in a single place. Then, in a compact line, they repulsed our cavalry, formed the phalanx, and moved towards our front line. Caesar first sent away his own horse out of sight, then did the same with everyone else's, to make the danger equal for everyone and to eliminate any opportunity for flight. Then he encouraged his men and joined battle. The soldiers who were posted higher up threw their javelins and easily shattered the enemy phalanx. Once it was broken, they drew their swords and charged the enemy. The Gauls were severely hindered in battle by the fact that many of their shields had been pierced and fastened together by the first javelin cast. The iron became bent, and they could not pull it out, nor could they fight properly with their left hand restricted. So after persistently shaking their left arm, many of them preferred to throw their shields away and fight unprotected. In the end, they were exhausted by their wounds and began to retreat, moving back to a hill which was less than a mile away. They gained it. Our men were approaching as the boy and the Tulingi, who brought up the enemy rear with some 15,000 men, acted as a rear guard. They marched right up to our men, attacked them on their exposed side, and surrounded them. When the Helvetii, who had retreated to the mountains, saw this, they went back on the offensive and began the battle afresh. The Romans wheeled and advanced in 2 divisions, the first and second lines facing the enemy forces, which had already been defeated and driven off, the third resisting the fresh attack. 26. The battle continued long and fierce on both fronts. When the Gauls could no longer sustain our assault, the Helvetii retreated once more to the mountain, and the boy and the Tulingi headed for their baggage and wagons. Throughout the whole battle, moreover, despite the fact that it lasted from the 7th hour until evening, no one could see an enemy soldier turned in flight. Beside the baggage, the fight continued far into the night, for they had formed a rampart from the wagons, and from this vantage point began to throw missiles at our men as they advanced. Down between the wagons and wheels, some were throwing pikes and javelins and wounding our men. After a protracted struggle, our men won possession of the baggage and the camp. There the daughter of Orgetorix was taken captive, and one of his sons. About 130,000 of the Helvetii survived this battle and marched all through that night. They did not break their journey to rest even once, and 3 days later reached the territory of the Lingones. Because the legionaries' wounds and the need to bury the dead, our men had been delayed for a period of 3 days and had not been able to pursue them. Caesar sent messages with a letter to the Lingones, warning them not to help the Helvetii by providing food or other necessaries. If anyone did offer assistance, he would treat them as enemies, just like the Helvetii. After the 3-day interval, he began the pursuit with all his forces. 27. The Helvetii were compelled, by their total lack of provisions, to send envoys to Caesar to discuss surrender. When they met him as he was on the march, they threw themselves at his feet, weeping and humbly begging him for peace. He gave orders that the Helvetii should remain where they were and await his arrival, and they obeyed him. When Caesar arrived, he demanded hostages, weapons, and the slaves who had deserted to the Helvetii. While these were being collected and brought together, night intervened, and about 6,000 men of the village known as Verbigine set out at dusk from the Helveti's camp and made for the Rhine and the land of the Germans. Perhaps they were full of fear at being made to hand over their weapons, or perhaps they were encouraged by the hope of safety, thinking that in such a huge crowd of prisoners their flight would be concealed or would even escape notice altogether. 28. After confirming his suspicion that this escape was taking place, Caesar ordered the peoples through whose territory they were escaping to track them down and bring them back, if they wished to clear themselves of suspicion. When they were returned, he treated them as enemies. As for all the rest, he accepted their surrender after the hostages, weapons, and deserters had been handed over. He ordered the Helvetii, Tulingi, and the Latavici to return to the lands from which they had come, and because their crops were all ruined and they had no means of sustenance in their homeland, he commanded the Allobroges to provide them with corn and told the Helvetii to rebuild the towns and villages which they had burned. His particular reason for this order was that he was reluctant for them to leave the place they had abandoned still unoccupied, in case the Germans, who lived across the Rhine, crossed out of their own land into that of the Helvetii because of the fertility of the soil and settled on the borders of the province of Gaul and of the Allobroges. At the Aedui request, he allowed the boy, who were famous for their great bravery, to settle in Aeduan territory. The Aedui gave farmland to them and later admitted them to the equal rights and freedom. 29. Tablets were found in the Helveti's camp, written in the Greek characters, and were taken to Caesar. They contained a complete record under several headings. The numbers which had set out from the homeland, but those capable of bearing arms, and a separate list of the boys, the old men, and the women. The sum total of all these categories came to 263,000 of the Helvetii. Of the Tulingi there were 36,000, of the Latavici 14,000, of the Rorici 23,000, and of the boy 32,000. About 92,000 of these were capable of bearing arms. The total number was about 368,000. When a census was taken of those who returned home in accordance with Caesar's orders, the number came to 110,000. 30. At the end of the war with the Helvetii, the leaders of almost all the Gallic states came as envoys to congratulate Caesar. They were aware, they said, that Caesar's aim had been to exact punishment in return for outrages long ago inflicted on the Roman people by the Helvetii. Nonetheless, the envoys went on. The outcome was as much to Gaul's advantage as to the Roman people's, for the Helvetii had left their homes, where they enjoyed great prosperity, with the express intention of making war upon all Gaul and snatching dominion. From an abundance of sites, the Helvetii had intended to select for their home the area which they adjudged the most conveniently situated and fertile, and to make the other states tributary. The envoys requested Caesar's permission to announce a meeting of all Gaul for a particular date, for there were certain requests they wished to make of him once they had come to an agreement among themselves. Their request was granted. They fixed the date of the meeting and swore an oath that none but those men designated by common agreement would divulge the proceedings. Excuse me. 31. When this meeting was ended, the same leaders of the Gallic states as before returned again to Caesar. They asked permission to discuss with him a secret both their own welfare and the good of all. When he agreed, they all wept and threw themselves at Caesar's feet. They were as anxious, they explained, to ensure that their discussion would not become public as they were to obtain what they wanted. For if it were made public, they foresaw for themselves a terrible punishment. Their spokesman was the Aeduan Divicius, and he explained that within Gaul as a whole there were two factions, one led by the Aedui and the other by the Averni. For many years the two had been fighting fiercely for supremacy. Then, he said, it came about that the Averni and the Sequani hired some German mercenaries. Initially about 15,000 of them crossed the Rhine. But once these wild and savage men had conceived a passionate desire for the lands of the Gauls, their way of life and their wealth, more of them had crossed the river. There were now about 120,000 of them in Gaul. Divicius went on to say that the Aedui and their dependents had frequently fought with the Germans but had been defeated, suffering disastrous ruin, and had lost all their aristocracy, their senate, and their entire cavalry. Broken by these disastrous battles, those men who had previously been preeminent in Gaul by reason of both their own excellence and the hospitality and friendship of the Roman people were forced to surrender their most aristocratic citizens as hostages to the Sequani, and to bind the state by an oath, never to ask for the hostages' return, nor to beg the help of the Roman people, nor to deny their perpetual subjection to the power and dominion of the Sequani. Alone of all the men of the Aeduan state, he, Divicius, could not be constrained to swear the oath or surrender his own children as hostages. For this reason, namely his lone refusal to be bound by the oath and the giving of hostages, he had fled the state and come to the Senate at Rome to plead for help. And yet, he continued, a worse fate had befallen the victorious Sequani than the defeated Aedui. For Arivistus, the king of the Germans, had settled in their territory and seized 1/3 of their land, which was the best in the whole of Gaul, and he was now ordering the Sequani to vacate another third, because 24,000 men of Harudes had joined him a few months before, and he was making a place ready for them to settle in. In a few years they would all be driven out of Gaul, and in turn all the Germans would cross the Rhine. After all, there was no comparison between Gallic and land and German, nor was there any contest between the two ways of life. Meanwhile, Ariovistus, as soon as he had engaged with the Gallic forces and defeated them, a battle which took place at Admagetabriga, began to issue arrogant and cruel commands. He demanded the children of all the highest-ranking citizens as hostages, and then inflicted all kinds of torture on them as a warning should anything be done contrary to his will and pleasure. Ariovistus was a savage. Ariovistus was a savage, a reckless hothead. They could endure his dictates no longer. Unless Caesar and the Roman people could help, the whole of Gaul would have to do what the Helvetii had once done, leave their homes and seek out another place to dwell in, far away from the Germans, and to risk whatever fortune might befall. If Ariovistus got to hear of this warning, said Divicius, he was certain all the hostages in his keeping would be made to pay the ultimate penalty. But Caesar, either through his own and his army's influence, or because of his recent victory, or through the renown of the Roman people, could discourage him from bringing the Germans over the Rhine in even greater numbers, and could defend all Gaul from Ariovistus's outrages. At the end of Divicius's speech, all who were present began amid much weeping to petition Caesar for help. But Caesar noticed that of all of them only the Sequani did not act in accord with the rest, but stood looking grave, heads bowed, staring at the ground. Wondering why this was so, he asked them, but they did not reply and maintained the same grave silence. When he repeatedly questioned them and yet could elicit no response whatever, Divicius the Aeduan answered him and explained that the Sequani had been more unhappy and unfortunate than everyone else, for they alone did not even dare to complain in secret or to beg for help. Even in his absence they were as afraid of Ariovistus's cruelty as if he were actually present. Everyone else, at least, had some chance of escape, but the Sequani had received Ariovistus within their own borders. All their towns were in his power, and they must endure whatever torments he inflicted. 33. On receiving this information, Caesar spoke words of encouragement to the Gauls, and promised to take care of the matter. He was confident, he assured them, that Ariovistus would be encouraged to stop his outrageous behavior by Caesar's special favor and influence. He then dismissed the meeting. Many considerations persuaded him to think it his duty to consider this matter and to intervene in it. For one thing, the Aedui, who had more than once been named brothers and kinsmen by the Roman Senate, were now enslaved under the dominion of the Germans, and their hostages were in the keeping of Ariovistus and the Sequani. When he considered the great power of the Roman people, this was a strong reproach to himself and to the Roman state. He could see that for the Germans to be accustomed by degrees to crossing the Rhine and entering Gaul in large numbers posed a threat to the Roman people, nor did he reckon that such fierce barbarians would hesitate once they had seized the whole of Gaul before flooding into the province of the Cimbri and the Teutoni had done years before, and then making for Italy, especially since only the Rhone separated the Sequani from our province. These dangers, he believed, must be countered as swiftly as possible. Indeed, Ariovistus himself had assumed such arrogance, such an air of haughty pride, as was not to be borne. 34. For these reasons, Caesar decided to send envoys to Ariovistus to ask him to select some location midway between the two sides for a parley. He himself wished to discuss state affairs and business of urgent interest to both parties. Ariovistus replied to this embassy, saying that had he needed anything from Caesar, he would have approached Caesar. But if Caesar wanted something from him, Caesar should do the approaching. Moreover, he went on, he did not dare to enter those parts of Gaul under Caesar's control without his army, and he was unable to muster his men in a single place without going to great trouble and effort over supplies. He ended by saying that he found it remarkable that either Caesar or, for that matter, the Roman people was troubled over Gaul, which he had made his own by right of conquest in war. 35. Ariovistus' words were reported to Caesar, who sent the envoys back to him with the following message. Ariovistus had been treated with great kindness by Caesar and the Roman people when, during Caesar's consulship, he had been pronounced king and friend by the Roman Senate. Since, however, he had shown his gratitude to Caesar and the Roman people by being reluctant to attend a parley when invited, and by seeing no reason to discuss or listen to matters of concern to both sides, Caesar was making the following demands of him. First, he should no longer bring large numbers of men over the Rhine into Gaul. Second, he must return the hostages he had taken from the Aedui and grant the Sequani full permission to return to the Aedui the hostages they were holding. He was to do no harm to the Aedui nor attack them or their allies. If Ariovistus complied with these instructions, he would have the lasting favor and friendship of Caesar and the Roman people, but the Senate had decided in the consulship of Marcus Messala and Marcus Piso that whoever was in command of the province of Gaul was empowered to act in the state's interest and defend the Aedui and the other friends of the Roman people. So if Caesar did not get what he wanted, he would not ignore wrongs inflicted upon the Aedui. 36. Ariovistus replied that the laws of warfare said conquerors could rule those they had conquered in whatever way they chose. Moreover, the Romans were themselves accustomed to ruling the conquered according to their own judgment, rather than another man's orders. If he, Ariovistus, was not telling the Roman people how to handle their own jurisdiction, it was not right that they should hinder him in the exercise of his. After hazarding the fortunes of war, attacking him, and being beaten, the Aedui had become his tribute payers. Caesar was doing him a great wrong, for his advance was having a bad effect upon these tax revenues. He was not going to give the Aedui their hostages back, but neither would he wrongfully wage war upon them or their allies if they stuck to the agreement and paid the annual tribute. If they did not, the title of brothers of the Roman people would be of no use to them at all. As for Caesar's declaration that he would be mindful of any wrongs done to the Aedui, no one had ever fought with Ariovistus and not been destroyed. Caesar could engage when he pleased, then he would understand what the undefeated Germans could achieve by their courage. Men who with their extraordinary skill in weapons had not been beneath a roof in 14 years. 37. At the same time as this speech was reported to Caesar, envoys arrived from the Aedui and the Treveri. The Aedui came to protest about the Herudes, who had only recently been brought across into Gaul and were ravaging their territory. Not even by surrendering hostages, they said, could they win peace from Ariovistus. The Treveri complained that 100 communities of the Suebi had settled on the banks of the Rhine and were trying to cross the river under the command of two brothers called Nasua and Symbirius. Caesar was much disturbed by these matters and realized he must act swiftly before this new band of Suebi joined up Ariovistus's veteran forces, making the task of defense more difficult. So he secured the corn supply at great speed and then headed towards Ariovistus by forced marches. 3. After 3 days' march, Caesar was informed that Ariovistus was making for Vesontio, the main town of the Sequani, with all his forces to seize control of it, and that he was already 3 days out from his own borders. Caesar knew he must make every effort to prevent this happening, for the town contained an abundance of the resources necessary for warfare. It was also protected by its natural site in such a way as to provide a strong position for conducting a campaign, especially since the river Doubs practically surrounds the entire town, like a circle drawn with compasses. The remaining perimeter of not much more than 1,600 feet, where the river does not flow, is filled in by a high mountain, the roots of which touch the banks of the river on either side. A wall around its base makes it into a citadel and links it with the town. Caesar made for this place, marching day and night. He seized the town and posted a garrison in it. 39. He remained in Vesontio for a few days to gather corn and supplies, during which time such a terrible panic suddenly seized our whole army it severely affected everyone's courage and morale. Our men started asking questions, and the Gauls and traders replied, describing how tall and strong the Germans were, how unbelievably brave and skillful with weapons. Often they claimed, when they had met the Germans in battle, they had been unable to stand even the way they looked, the sternness of their gaze. The panic began among the military tribunes and prefects, and the other men who, having no great military experience, had followed Caesar from Rome to court his friendship. Some of them started offering various excuses for urgent departure and asked his permission to go. Others stayed behind out of shame, wanting to avoid the taint of cowardice. These men could not conceal their fearful expressions, nor at times could they restrain their tears. They hid themselves away in their tents and bemoaned their fate, or among their friends lamented the common danger. Throughout the camp all the men were signing and sealing their wills. Thanks to their fearful complaining, gradually even men of great military experience began to be affected. The legionary soldiers, centurions, and cavalry officers, some were eager to appear less cowardly, and declared that it was not the enemy they feared, but the restricted narrow route of the march, the depths of the forest between themselves and Ariovistus, or the arrangement of satisfactory transport for the corn supply. Some even went so far as to tell Caesar that although he had given the order to strike camp and move out, the soldiers would not obey him and, because of their fear, would refuse to lift the standards. 40. As soon as Caesar was aware of the situation, he called a council, ordered centurions of all ranks to attend, and severely reprimanded them, primarily for thinking that it was their business to inquire or think about either the direction or the strategy of the march. During his consulship, Caesar went on, Ariovistus had eagerly sought friendly relations with the Roman people. Why would anyone now conclude that he was going to abandon his obligations rashly? In fact, he was convinced that once Ariovistus understood the terms he was offering and considered the fairness of the conditions, he would not spurn the favor either of Caesar or of the Roman people. And even if Ariovistus did start a war, Caesar continued, spurred on by some mad fury, what was there to fear even then? Why did they despair of their own courage or of his anxious concern for their well-being? The danger posed by this enemy had already been experienced in the time of our fathers, when the Cimbri and the Teutoni were expelled by Gaius Marius. On that occasion it was clear that the army had deserved as much credit as its commander. The same danger had also been experienced more recently during the slave revolt in Italy. In this instance, the slaves were helped to some degree by the experience and training which they had received from us. From all this, said Caesar, they could see how crucial was firmness of purpose. After all, for a time they had feared the slaves who were then without weapons, yet later they had defeated those same slaves after they were armed and had won battles. Finally, the Germans were the same people who had often clashed with the Helvetii, and the Helvetii had frequently beaten them, not only within their own borders, but also in Germany itself, and yet the Helvetii had proved no match for our army. Perhaps, he went on, some of those present were disturbed by the defeat and flight of the Gauls, but if they took the trouble to inquire, they would discover that the Gauls had been worn down by the long duration of the campaign, before Ariovistus, who had for many months been skulking in his camp in the marshes, giving them no chance to attack him, suddenly launched his assault upon them, when the Gauls had given up hope of battle and they had already dispersed. He had won, then, more by tactical planning than by conspicuous bravery. And even if there was a place for these tactics when faced with barbarians of no military skill, not even Ariovistus would pin his hopes on the success of such tactics as a means of beating our army. As for those who shifted the blame for their own fear onto a pretended anxiety about corn supplies or the narrowness of the route, they were doing so out of presumption. After all, they apparently either doubted the commander's commitment or they were dictating it to Caesar. Yet his attention was taken up with all these things. The Sequani, the Luci, the Lingones were supplying corn, and the crop was already ripe in the fields. As for the route of their march, in a short while they would themselves decide it. On the subject of their declared intention not to follow orders and raise the standards, it did not trouble him at all. He was well aware that whenever an army had disobeyed its commander in the past, it was either because fortune had deserted him, as proven by his failure on the field, or because he had been discovered in some crime and found guilty of rapacity. That he, Caesar, was himself guilty of no crime, and it was evident from the whole course of his life. That he was a man who enjoyed a good fortune was evident from his campaign against the Helvetii. And so Caesar concluded he would do at once what he had intended to put off till a later date. The very next night, during the fourth watch, they would strike camp. Then he would know as soon as possible whether their sense of shame and duty was stronger than their fear. Moreover, even if no one at all followed him, then he would still set out with only the 10th Legion, for he had no doubts about its loyalty. Indeed, it would in the future serve as his bodyguard. Caesar had treated this legion with special favor and had fullest confidence in its courage. Let's see how. 41. At the end of the speech, the change of attitude was quite remarkable, and there arose an immense enthusiasm and eagerness to start the campaign. The 10th Legion was first to express its thanks to Caesar, through the military tribunes, for the excellent opinion he had formed of it, and it declared its readiness to start the campaign. Then the other legions earned their military tribunes and senior centurions to make amends to Caesar. They claimed they had never been in doubt nor afraid, nor did they think the supreme command belonged to them instead of their commander. Their apology was accepted. Through Divicius, in whom alone Caesar had particular trust, a route was discovered for the march. By means of a detour of more than 46 miles, it led the army through open country. They set out, as Caesar had said, during the 4th watch. On the 7th day of the marching, without a break, his scouts told Caesar that Ariovistus' army was only 22 miles off. 42. Once Ariovistus learned that Caesar was at hand, he sent envoys to him to say that, as far as he was concerned, the parley Caesar had previously demanded could now take place, especially as Caesar had moved nearer, which meant that Ariovistus could now attend without risk. Caesar, who thought Ariovistus had by now come to his senses, since he was now offering unasked what he had previously refused to do when expressly requested, did not reject this proposal. He was hopeful that in return for signal services rendered to Ariovistus by both Caesar himself and the Roman people, Ariovistus would abandon his stubbornness once he knew Caesar's terms. The 5th day following this was appointed for the parley. In the interim, when the envoys went back and forth between the two sides, Ariovistus made it a condition that Caesar should not bring any infantry to the parley, claiming that he feared being surrounded and trapped. Both sides, Ariovistus went on, should come with cavalry. Otherwise he would not come at all. Caesar was reluctant to have the parley halted on a pretext, yet did not care to entrust his safety to Gallic cavalry. The most convenient solution, Caesar decided, was to take away the horses of the Gallic cavalry and mount on them instead the soldiers of the 10th Legion, in whom he had the fullest confidence. In this way he would secure a devoted bodyguard just in case he needed it. There was some wit in doing so, pointed out one soldier of the 10th. Caesar was doing more for them than he had promised, for he had vowed to keep the 10th as his bodyguard, but was now enrolling them among the Equites. 43. There was a large level area, and on its mound of earth of considerable size. The place was almost equidistant from the camps of Ariovistus and Caesar. To this place, as was mentioned above, they came for the parley. Caesar halted the legion, which he had mounted on horseback, at a distance of 200 paces from the mound. Ariovistus' cavalry stopped at a similar distance, and he stipulated that they should hold the parley on horseback and bring 10 men with them. When they came to the place, Caesar began by speaking of the benefits conferred by himself and by the Roman Senate, namely, that Ariovistus had been declared king and friend by the Senate, and that gifts had been showered upon him. Caesar pointed out that the privilege was one granted to few, and usually bestowed in return for signal services. Although Ariovistus had no right of access to the Senate, nor any just cause for claim, he had received those rewards through the generosity of Caesar and the Senate. Caesar further pointed out that the reason for friendship existing between the Romans and the Agii were appropriate and long-standing, and cited the frequency of the decrees of the Senate conferring honor upon the Agii. They had, Caesar said, always held a position of control over all Gaul, even before they had sought our friendship. It was the Roman people's custom, Caesar concluded, not only not to deprive their friends and allies of any property, but also to desire the increase of their favor, prestige, and distinction. Who could allow them to be robbed of what they had brought to the friendship of the Roman people? He then set out the same terms that he had given in his instructions to the envoys, namely, to make no war upon the Agii or their allies, to return the hostages, and if Ariovistus could not send any section of the Germans home, at least to prevent any more from crossing the Rhine. Hey, Liz. Thanks. Alright, 44. Figure I needed a little bit more background instead of black. More exciting. 44. Ariovistus made a curt reply to Caesar's demands, but then spoke long and loud of his own excellence. He had not crossed the Rhine of his own accord, but at the express request of the Gauls. He had left his home and family in the sure hope of considerable gains. He held a place in Gaul granted by the Gauls themselves, and hostages which they had willingly surrendered, and he was exacting a tribute by right of war, such as victors usually impose upon the conquered. He had not made war upon the Gauls, but rather they upon him. Every Gallic people had come to attack him, and had started operations against him, and their entire force had been routed and overcome by him in a single battle. If they wished to test the strength of Ariovistus again, he was still prepared to fight it out. But if they wished to enjoy peace, it was not right to refuse payment of tribute, which until now they had willingly paid out. The friendship of the Roman people should be a distinction and protection, not a drawback. That was why he had sought it. If through the Roman people the tribute was now paid back and the hostages returned, he would reject their friendship as freely as once he had sought it. As to the fact that he was bringing hordes of Germans into Gaul, Ariovistus went on, this was for his own protection, not as a means of attacking Gaul. The proof of this was that he would not have come had he not been asked, and that he had not gone on the offensive, but had defended himself. He had entered Gaul before the Roman people did. Never before had the army of the Roman people moved outside the boundaries of the province. What did Caesar want with him? Why was Caesar coming into his territory? This part of Gaul was Ariovistus's province, just as the other part was ours. If he had attacked our lands, it would not be right to give way. Likewise, it would be wrong for us to interfere in Ariovistus's jurisdiction. As for Caesar's statement that the Agii had been named brothers, he was not such a barbarian, nor so ignorant of affairs, as to be unaware that neither in the last war against the Allobroges did the Agii offer the Romans help, nor did they in turn enjoy the assistance of the Roman people in their internal disputes and their contentions with the Sequani. He was bound to suspect that Caesar's friendship was a pretense. After all, he had an army in Gaul, an army to crush him with. Unless Caesar left the area and took his army with him, he would treat him no longer as a friend, but as an enemy. In fact, said Ariovistus, if he killed Caesar, he would earn the gratitude of many aristocrats and leaders at Rome. He knew this for a fact from those very men, through their messengers, and by Caesar's death he could win the favor and friendship of them all. If, on the other hand, Caesar departed and handed over full control of Gaul to him, he would give him a great reward, and whatever wars he wanted waged, these would be accomplished without any effort or risk on Caesar's part. 45. Caesar explained at some length why he could not abandon the business in hand. Neither his own custom nor the Roman people's allowed him to desert such loyal allies, nor did he consider that Gaul belonged any more to Ariovistus than to the Roman people. The Arverni and Rutini had been defeated by Quintus Fabius Maximus, and then pardoned by the Roman people, but were not turned into a province nor made to pay tribute. If priority of arrival was what counted, then the Roman people's rule over Gaul was fully justified. But if they followed the decision of the Senate, then Gaul, which the Senate had wished to keep its own laws after its defeat, should be free. 46. During the parley, Caesar had heard news that Ariovistus's cavalry was coming quite close to the earth mound and riding up to our men, throwing stones and missiles at them. He finished speaking and returned to his men, ordering them not to throw so much as a single missile in return. For although he realized that a battle between his favorite legion and the enemy cavalry would pose no risk, nonetheless he considered a fight inadvisable. Thus, once the enemy was beaten, they could not say that they had trusted Caesar's assurances and been entrapped by him at a parley. When news of the arrogance with which Ariovistus had behaved at the parley spread to the soldiers, how he had ordered the Romans out of the whole of Gaul, how his cavalry had attacked our men, and how this had led to the breaking off of talks, they were filled with even greater eagerness and enthusiasm for the fight. Oh, that's no problem. You can always go back later and watch. It'll be saved. All right, where was I? Oh yeah, 47. 2 days later, Ariovistus sent envoys to Caesar. He wished to continue with him discussion of those matters which they had earlier started but not finished. So would Caesar either decide once more the date for a parley, or, if he was reluctant to do so, would he send back an envoy of his own? Caesar saw no reason for talks, the more so since the day before it had proved impossible to prevent the Germans throwing missiles at our men. In his view, to send one of his envoys to Ariovistus would be highly dangerous, as he would be at the mercy of the barbarians. The most convenient solution was to send Gaius Valerius Priscillus, the son of Gaius Valerius Caburus, who had been granted citizenship by Gaius Valerius Flaccus. Priscillus was both a brave and cultured young man, and because of his loyalty and his fluency in the Gallic language, which Ariovistus by long custom habitually used, and also because there was no reason for the Germans to do him any harm, he was sent along with Marcus Medius, who enjoyed Ariovistus's friendship. Caesar ordered them to discover what Ariovistus was saying and report back. When, however, Ariovistus saw them in his camp, he cried out before his whole army, asking why they had come. Was it to spy? He prevented them from saying anything and put them in chains. 48. That same day he struck camp, moved out, and took up a position at the foot of a mountain 5.5 miles from Caesar's camp. On the following day, he marched his forces past Caesar's camp and encamped 2 miles further on, with the intention of cutting Caesar off from the corn and supplies which were being transported by the Sequani and the Aedui. From that day on, for 5 days without a break, Caesar led out his own forces in front of the camp drawn up in battle formation. Thus, if Ariovistus wanted to engage, he would have his opportunity. During these days, Ariovistus kept his army in camp, but engaged in a daily cavalry battle. The kind of fighting in which the Germans were practiced was this. There were 6,000 cavalry, and the same number of swift and courageous infantry, each of the latter chosen by a cavalryman from the whole force for his protection. In battle, they operated together. The cavalry would fall back towards the foot soldiers, who would quickly mass if trouble loomed. If a cavalryman was badly wounded and fell from his horse, the soldiers would surround him, and if it was necessary to advance some distance or retreat swiftly, they had such speed because of their training that they could keep pace by holding on to the horses' manes. 49. Caesar realized that Ariovistus was staying in his camp, so to avoid further hindrance to supplies, he selected a spot suitable for a second camp, about 600 paces beyond the place where the Germans were positioned. He marched to this spot in a triple line formation, then ordered the first and second lines to stand at the ready, and the third line to construct defenses for the camp. This position was, as was mentioned, about 600 paces from the enemy. Ariovistus sent towards it a force of about 16,000 troops, together with all the cavalry, to terrify our forces and hinder the work of the fortification. Nevertheless, Caesar still ordered the 2 lines to drive away the enemy, as he had earlier decided, and told the third to finish its defense work. Once the camp was fortified, he left 2 legions there and a section of auxiliaries. The 4 remaining legions he led back to the main camp. 50. Next day he led his forces out of both camps, as usual advanced a short distance from the main camp, and drew up his battle line, thus giving the enemy an opportunity of joining battle. Once he saw that not even then did they emerge, around noon he took his army back to camp. Then at last Ariovistus sent out a section of his forces to attack the smaller camp. The fight was fierce on both sides until night fell, at which point, after many wounds had been inflicted and also endured, Ariovistus withdrew his forces back to camp. When Caesar asked some prisoners why Ariovistus did not engage, he discovered that the reason was a custom of the Germans. Using lots in divination, their older women used to declare whether they could join battle with advantage or not, and they said it was not heaven's will that the Germans should win if they joined battle before the new moon. 51. Next day Caesar left what seemed an adequate garrison for each camp, Then he placed all his auxiliaries before the smaller camp in sight of the enemy to use them for show, as he was rather weak in numbers of legionary soldiers in comparison with the numbers of the enemy. He himself drew up a triple battle line and advanced right up to the enemy camp. Then at last, of necessity, the Germans led out their own forces from camp and stationed them at equal intervals according to their communities, the Herudes, the Marcomanni, the Tribuces, the Vangiones, the Nemetes, the Sadduci, and the Suebi. They surrounded their battle line with wagons and carts so as to leave no hope of flight. There they placed their women, who with outstretched arms and weeping begged the men setting out to battle not to hand them over into Roman slavery. 52. Caesar put 5 legates and a quaestor, each in charge of a legion, to act as witnesses of each man's valor. He started the battle from the right wing, as he had observed that there the enemy was weakest. At the signal, our men attacked the enemy so fiercely, and the enemy rushed forward so suddenly and swiftly, that there was no room for throwing javelins at the foe. These weapons were cast aside as sword fights ensued. The Germans, as was their custom, quickly formed the phalanx to sustain our attack. Several of our men were found leaping on to the massed enemy, tearing away their shields with their hands and wounding them from above. Although the enemy line was forced back on the left wing and put to flight, on the right it was pressing on our line by sheer force of numbers. A young man called Publius Crassus, he was in charge of the cavalry, noticed this, and as he was more at liberty to act than those men who were occupied between the lines, he sent the third line in to help our men in difficulties. 53. So the battle swung back in our favor, and all the enemy turned tail and did not stop running until they reached the Rhine. Nearly 5 miles away from the field of battle, there a very few trusted in their own strength and aimed to swim across or found boats and thus ensured their own safety. Ariovistus was of their number. He found a small boat moored to the bank and escaped in it. Our men pursued all the rest of the enemy with cavalry and killed them. Ariovistus had 2 wives, one a woman of Suebi, he had brought her with him from Germany, and one from Noricum, the sister of King Voccio, who had sent her to be married to him in Gaul. Both wives perished in the flight. One of his daughters also died, but the other was captured. Gaius Valerius Priscillus, bound in triple chains, was being dragged by his guards in the flight when he met with Caesar himself, pursuing the enemy with the cavalry. It brought Caesar as much pleasure as the victory itself to see this most worthy provincial, his own companion and close friend, snatched from the hand of the enemy and restored to him. Nor had Priscillus suffered any terrible fate such as would lessen in any degree Caesar's great pleasure and joy. Priscillus recounted how in his presence lots had 3 times been cast to decide whether he should be burned to death or kept back for a later occasion, but thanks to the lots he was uninjured. So also Marcus Medius was found and taken back to Caesar. 54. News of the battle spread across the Rhine. The Suebi, who had come to the banks of the river, began to move back home, and when the people who dwell near the Rhine realized their panic, they pursued and killed a large number of them. Caesar had conducted 2 major campaigns in a single season, and now, a little later than the time of year required, he led his army to the land of the Sequani to winter quarters. There he put Labienus in charge. He himself set out for nearer Gaul to hold assizes. That's the end of the first book. Wonder how long the second book is. Oh, the second one's not that long. Alright, so we're going to do the second one, I think, because we've been streaming for almost an hour and a half. So yeah, we'll do the second book. Let me just refill my mug. Otherwise it's going to get too scratchy. All right. bit warm. All right. The second book, 57 BC, AUC 697, Consuls Publius Cornelius Lentulus, Spinther, Quintus Caecilius Metellus Nepos. Defeats for the Belgic peoples. 1. As we mentioned above, Caesar was in Near Gaul. There he heard a host of rumors, confirmed by a letter from Labienus, that all the Belgae, who make up 1/3 of Gaul, as we said before, were hatching a plot against the Roman people and exchanging hostages. Blech. The reason for this plot were as follows. First, they were afraid that our army would march against them now all the rest of Gaul had been subdued. Secondly, they were being stirred up by a number of the Gauls, some of whom had been unwilling for the Germans to have any further involvement in Gaul, and were equally reluctant for the army of the Roman people to overwinter and become established there. Others were of a volatile and unstable disposition, the sort of men who delight in changes of rule. Yet another group incited the Belgae to conspire because it was common in Gaul for men who possessed some degree of power and the means to hire support to seize regal power, something which would be more difficult to achieve under our rule. These reports and Labienus' dispatch prompted Caesar to enlist 2 new legions in Near Gaul. And once the campaigning season had begun, he sent his legate, Quintus Pedius, to lead them to further Gaul. He himself went to join his army as soon as a supply of fodder became available. To the Senones and the other Gauls who were neighboring of the Belgae, he gave the task of finding out what the Belgae were doing and of keeping him informed of developments. They all loyally reported that gangs were mustering and an army assembling in one place. Then he knew it was imperative that he set out for the territory of the Belgae. Caesar secured a supply of corn, struck camp, and moved out. Within about a fortnight, he had reached the borders of the Belgae. 3. He arrived unexpectedly and more quickly than anyone had foreseen. The Remi, the Belgic people closest to Gaul, sent him envoys called Icius and Andecombrorius, who were both leading citizens. They declared that they were entrusting themselves and all their possessions to the good faith and power of the Roman people. They did not agree with the other Belgic peoples, nor were they plotting against the Roman people. They were prepared to surrender hostages and obey orders, and to admit Caesar into their towns and assist him by supplying corn and other necessaries. All the rest of the Belgae were ready for war, and the Germans dwelling on this side of the Rhine had joined them. They were all in such a state of fury, Icius and Andecombrorius concluded, that it had proved impossible to dissuade even the Senones from joining the conspiracy, though they were close kinsmen and shared the same jurisdiction and laws, and also the same government and magistracies. When Caesar asked the 2 envoys about the Belgic states how many were under arms and what was their strength in war, he discovered that most of the Belgae were of German extraction and had long ago crossed the Rhine and settled on the western side because of the fertility of the soil. They had forced out the Gauls who dwelt there. In our father's time, when the Cimbri and the Teutoni were harassing the whole of Gaul, only the Belgae had stopped them entering their own territory. So it transpired that they had acquired an aura of great authority and courage in military matters by the memory of this achievement. The Remi claimed to have complete information about the Belgae's numerical strength because they were closely connected both by physical proximity and ties of marriage. They knew how many men each leader had pledged for the war at the General Council of the Belgae. The strongest people among the Belgae in terms of bravery, influence, and numbers were the Bellovaci. They could supply 100,000 armed men and had promised to select 60,000 from that number. At first they demanded command of the entire campaign for themselves. Their neighbors were the Saxones, who possessed extensive and fertile territories. Within living memory, they had a king called Divicius who was the most powerful in the whole of Gaul and controlled a large portion of that region and also of Britain. Now their king was a man called Galba. Because he was a just and cautious ruler, everyone agreed to give him overall control of the entire war. He had control of 12 towns and was pledging 50,000 soldiers. The Nervi, a people dwelling far off and considered particularly fierce by the Gauls themselves, pledged a similar number. The Atrebides pledged 15,000, the Ambiani 10,000, the Morini 25,000, the Menapi 7,000, the Coleti 10,000, the Veliacases and Veramandui 10,000 between them, and the Adoatucci 19,000. The Remi thought that the Count Drusi, Eubrones, Cirosi, and Parmani, who are collectively known as Germans, could supply about 40,000 men. 5. Caesar addressed the Remi with words of generous encouragement. He ordered their whole senate to come before him, and the children of leading citizens to be brought as hostages. These demands were scrupulously and promptly carried out. Caesar encouraged Divicius and the Aeduan warmly, and explained how important it was for the Republic and the common good to keep the enemy groups apart, so as to avoid having to engage with such a huge force all at once. This could be achieved if the Aedui brought their forces into the Bellovaces' territory and began to plunder their lands. With these instructions, he dismissed Divicius. Once he observed that all the Belgic forces had gathered together and were marching towards him, and learned from the scouts he had sent out and from the Remi that they were getting close, Caesar hastened to take his army across the river Asne, which is the most distant reaches of the Remi's territory, and pitched camp. Thus one side of the camp was protected by the river bank, and the rear was secure from the enemy. Moreover, it ensured that the Remi and other peoples could ferry supplies to Caesar without danger. There was a bridge over this river. Caesar garrisoned it, and further along the river left his legate, Quintus Titurius Sabinus, with 6 cohorts. He ordered him to build a camp with a 12-foot rampart and an 18-foot ditch. 6. 8 miles away from this camp was a town of the Remi called Bibrax. Whilst actually on the march, the Belgae suddenly turned to attack it with great force. The town barely held out on that day. The siege method of the Gauls and the Belgae is very similar. First, a line of men is placed all around the walls, and they begin to throw stones in the direction of the wall. When the wall has lost all its defenders, they form a tortoise, come in close, and undermine the wall. On this occasion, the task was easy, for when such a vast number of men was throwing stones and missiles, there was no possibility of anyone remaining standing on the wall. In command of the town was Iccius, one of the Remi, a man of good birth and reputation among his people. When night fell, he sent a man who had been part of the peace embassy to Caesar to tell him what was happening. Unless Caesar sent help, they could not hold out any longer. 7. Around midnight, Caesar sent Numidian and Cretan archers and Balearic slingers to help the people of Bibrax, under the leadership of the same men who had come bringing news from Iccius. Their arrival gave the Remi fresh enthusiasm for the fight as well as a hope for the defense. And for the same reason, it dispelled the enemy's hope of taking the town. So after lingering in the vicinity, ravaging the lands of the Remi, and setting fire to all the villages and buildings within reach, the whole Belgic army turned and made for Caesar's camp. They pitched camp less than 2 miles off, a camp which, as the smoke and fires showed, was more than 7 miles round. 8. At first, because the enemy was so numerous, and because of his outstanding reputation for courage, Caesar avoided giving battle. By means of daily cavalry skirmishes, however, he ascertained how brave they really were, and how daring our men could afford to be. Once he realized that our men were not inferior, he chose a place in front of his camp, which was naturally convenient and suitable for forming a battle line. The hill on which the camp was pitched was slightly raised up from the plain, and had enough space in front for a battle line to take up a position at the ready. It sloped steeply on both flanks, but in front rose gently, to a ridge and then returned to the level. He constructed a ditch of about 400 paces at right angles from either side of the hill, and at the ends set up outposts and stationed his artillery. Thus, once the battle line was drawn up, despite their numerical strength, the enemy would not be able to fight on the flanks and surround his own men. He then left two recently enlisted legions in camp, so they could be mobilized as backup if necessary. The remaining 6 he drew up for battle in front of the camp. Likewise, the enemy led their forces out of camp and deployed them for battle. Getting exciting. Nine. Between our army and theirs was a small marsh. The enemy waited to see if our men would cross it, but our men were armed and ready to attack them while they were at a disadvantage if they crossed first. Meanwhile, a cavalry battle was taking place between the two lines. When neither side took the initiative by crossing first, and when the cavalry battle began to go in our favor, Caesar led his men back to camp. The enemy quickly left and made for the Asni, which, as was explained, was behind our camp. There they found fording places and tried to take a division of their forces across, intending, if possible, to storm the outpost where the legate Quintus Titurius was in command and destroy the bridge. If this proved impossible, they would devastate the land of the Remi, which was so important to our war effort, and thus cut off our supplies. 10. Once Titurius Sabinus had reported this to Caesar, he then led all the cavalry, the Numidian light armed troops, slingers, and archers over the bridge and marched towards the enemy. There a fierce battle was fought. Our men attacked the enemy while they were stuck in the water and killed a large number of them. The rest struggled with great daring to make their escape through the midst of the bodies, but were forced back by a shower of missiles. Those who had crossed first were surrounded by our cavalry and cut down. The enemy realized that their hopes of storming the town and crossing the river were a delusion, and observed that our men did not advance to fight on less favorable ground. Moreover, their supplies of corn were starting to run out, so they called a meeting and decided that the best thing would be for each man to return to his own home. Then they could all assemble to defend whichever territory the Roman army invaded first. They could fight better in their own territory than in that belonging to others, and could use their own supply of corn. They were led to this decision by, among other factors, the consideration that Diviscus and the Agii were making for the land of the Bellovaci, whom it was impossible to persuade to linger where they were, rather than going to the help of their own people. Voice is getting tired. 11. Following this decision during the second watch, they decamped with much noise and uproar, and no regular ranks or order of command, for each man was trying to be the first on the march and hastening to return home. The result was that the departure looked more like a flight. Caesar learned of it at once through his scouts and feared a trap. As yet he had no intelligence of the reason for their departure, and so kept the army and cavalry in camp. At first light, once his spies confirmed what had happened, Caesar sent the cavalry on ahead to slow up their rear guard. He put his legates Quintus Pedius and Lucius Aurunculius Cotta in charge of them, and ordered his legate Titus Labienus to follow in support with 3 legions. They reached the rear guard and attacked, then pursued them for many miles and killed a great number as they fled. When our men caught up with those in the rear of the main column, they stood their ground and courageously repelled our attacks, but those who were further ahead seemed far removed from the danger, and were restrained neither by necessity nor by orders. As soon as they heard the battle cry, they broke ranks and put their hope of safety in flight. The result was that our men, without any risk, killed as many of the enemy as time allowed. At nightfall they stopped and returned to camp as ordered. 12. Next day, before the enemy could recover from their panic and flight, Caesar led his army into the territory of the Saxones, which bordered that of the Remi, and by a forced march he made for the town of Noviodunum. On his arrival he tried to attack the town, as he had heard it lacked a garrison. Its ditches, however, were very wide, and its walls so high that he was unable to take it by storm. Despite the small numbers defending it, he fortified a camp and began to construct movable shelters and prepare other equipment for use in the siege operations. In the meantime, Suetonius had returned in full force from the rout and had entered the city the previous night. The movable shelters were swiftly brought up to the town, earthworks were erected, and the towers set up. Never before had the Gauls seen or heard of such immense siege works, and they were so disturbed by the Roman speed of action that they sent envoys to Caesar to negotiate surrender. Vermi interceded for their safety, and their request was granted. Hmm. 13. Caesar accepted leading citizens as hostages, including 2 sons of King Galba himself. All the town's weapons were handed over. He accepted the Suetonius' surrender and then led his army against the Bellovaci. They retreated into the town of Braduspantium, taking all their property with them. When Caesar and his army were only about 5 miles from the town, all the elders came out and started holding out their hands to him, and shouting that they entrusted themselves to his power and protection, and were not fighting against the Roman people. It was the same when he reached the town and pitched camp there. On the wall, boys and women with outstretched hands pleaded with the Romans for peace, which it was Caesar's custom to grant. 14. After the Belgae's retreat, Divicius had dismissed the Aeduan forces and returned to Caesar. Now he interceded on their behalf. The Bellovaci, he explained, had always been friends and allies of the Aeduan people. By saying that Caesar had enslaved the Aedui and was inflicting insults and indignities upon them, their leaders had driven them to break off relations with their former allies and make war upon the Roman people. Once they had realized the magnitude of the disaster they had inflicted upon their state, the men who initiated this policy had fled to Britain. Not only the Bellovaci, but also the Aedui on their behalf were begging Caesar to exercise his customary clemency and mercy towards them. If he did so, he would enhance the authority of the Aedui among all the Belgae, and the Aedui customarily relied upon their help and assistance in any warfare they undertook. 15. In order to give due respect to Divicius and the Aedui, Caesar said that he would spare the Bellovaci and accept them under his protection. As they were an important nation among the Belgae, with a population of significant size, he called for 600 hostages. Once these were handed over and all the town's weapons gathered in, he left Braduspantium and came to the land of the Ambiani, who straightway surrendered themselves and all their property as well. On the borders of their territory lived the Nervi. When Caesar inquired about their character and customs, he discovered the following. They permitted no merchants within their borders. They did not allow the import of wine and other luxury goods, because they believed such things enfeebled their spirit and weakened their courage. They were fierce men and very brave, who approached and condemned all the other Belgae for surrendering to the Roman people, and casting aside their ancestral courage, they declared that they would send no envoys and accept no peace terms. 16. Caesar had been marching through their territory for 3 days when he learned from prisoners that the river Sambre was a little more than 9 miles from his camp. On the other side of the river, the Nervi had halted and were awaiting the Romans' arrival. Together with 2 neighboring peoples whom the Nervi had persuaded to join them in trying their luck in war, namely the Atrebiades and the Veromandui, they were all waiting for the forces of the Aduatuci, which were already on their way, and they had sent the women and those men whose age excluded them from battle to a place which was too marshy to be accessible to an army. 17. Once he learned of these events, Caesar sent scouts and centurions on ahead to select a suitable place to encamp. A number of the Belgae and other Gauls who had surrendered were following in Caesar's train and journeying along with our army. Later, Caesar discovered from prisoners that during that time some of these men were observing our army's usual order and march. They then went by night to the Nervi and explained to them how a large amount of baggage was placed between the individual legions. Once the first legion had entered the camp, while the other legions were still far behind, they said, it would be no trouble to attack the first legion while it was still encumbered with heavy packs, and once it was routed and all the baggage plundered, the other legions would not dare to resist. The plan of the men who brought this information was helped by the fact that from ancient times the Nervi had never possessed any cavalry. And even now they show no interest in cavalry, but place whatever strength they do have in infantry. As a result, if the cavalry of neighboring peoples raided their territory, the Nervi could obstruct it all the more easily. They would do this by cutting into trees and bending them down because of the large number of branches sticking out horizontally, all tangled up with brambles and thorns. They ensured that these hedges provided them with a fortification the size of a wall. Not only was it impossible to penetrate this barrier, it was even impossible to see through it. As our army's march was being obstructed by these obstacles, the Nervi thought this plan should not be rejected. 18. The site which our scouts and centurions chose for the camp was of this kind. A hill sloped down from its summit at an even gradient along the edge of the Sombra, which we mentioned above. Another hill sloped up from the river at a similar gradient opposite our hill and facing it directly, clear and open for about 200 paces, but wooded higher up so that it was difficult to see within. The enemy concealed themselves in these woods. Down the river on open ground a few cavalry posts were visible. The river was about 3 feet deep. 19. Caesar sent his cavalry on ahead and then followed with all his forces, but he employed a different order and strategy of march from the one the Belgae had reported to the Nervi. Because he was approaching an enemy, Caesar was, as usual, leading the 6 legions, carrying only light kit. He had put the whole army's heavy baggage behind these legions, while the 2 legions most recently enlisted brought up the rear, the whole column, and acted as rear guard for the baggage. Our cavalry, slingers, and archers crossed the river and engaged with the enemy cavalry, who continually retreated into the woods and rejoined their comrades before coming out from the trees and attacking our men again. When the enemy retreated, our men dared not pursue the attack beyond the extent of level and open ground. Meanwhile, the 6 legions had already arrived, measured out the camp, and begun the work of fortification. The enemy formed up in battle order within the woods and strengthened their resolve. As soon as our army's baggage came into view of the enemy hidden in the woods, the moment they had agreed for joining battle, they suddenly rushed out in full force and launched an attack on our cavalry, which was easily repulsed and scattered. The enemy then ran at astonishing speed down to the river and so seemed, almost at one and the same moment, to be near the woods, then in the river, and now already upon us. With similar speed they made their way up the hill to our camp and attacked the men who were working on the fortifications. 20. Caesar had to see to everything at once. The flag must be unfurled. This was the signal to stand to arms. The trumpets sounded. The soldiers must be recalled from working on the defenses, and all those who had gone some way off in search of material for the earthworks had to be ordered back to camp. He must draw up his battle line, encourage the men, give the signal. There was too little time. The enemy pressed on so fast to complete these arrangements. 2 factors counterbalanced these difficulties. The first was the knowledge and experience of Caesar's men. Their training in previous battles had taught them what needed to be done so that they could just as easily devise their own orders as receive them from others. Secondly, Caesar had forbidden any of his officers to abandon either the defense works or their individual legions before the fortification of the camp was complete. And in fact, the enemy was so close at hand and moving so swiftly that these officers no longer thought of waiting for Caesar's orders, but began to make dispositions of their own accord as seemed necessary. 21. Once he had given all the appropriate orders, Caesar ran down where luck would take him to speak his encouragement to the men, and ended up among the 10th Legion. His speech was long enough only to urge them to remember their long-established record for bravery, and not to lose their nerve, but to resist the enemy assault with courage, for the enemy was within missile range of the Roman army. Then he gave the signal for battle. When Caesar moved to the other side to give encouragement, he found the men already fighting. Everything happened so quickly, and the enemy were so determined to fight, that there was no time for our men to fit on their emblems, or even to put on helmets and to take the covers from their shields. Wherever each man ended up after stopping work on the defenses, and whichever signal he saw first, there he took his stand, so as not to waste fighting time in looking for his comrades. 22. The Roman army was drawn up so as to take account of the natural terrain, the slope of the hill, and the need of the moment, rather than in accordance with any theoretical military formation. For the legions were resisting the enemy in different directions and different places, while the thick barrier hedges we mentioned before got in their way and obscured the view. It was impossible to allocate assistance to see what was needed where, or for one man to coordinate all commands. The difficult circumstances, therefore, were matched by a number of different outcomes. 23. The soldiers of the 9th and 10th legions had placed themselves on the left flank. They threw their spears and charged upon the Atrebates, whom they happened to be facing. The Atrebates were fatigued and exhausted after running and suffering from their wounds. Our men, who had the higher ground, quickly forced them into the river. The Atrebates tried to get across, but their way was blocked. Our men caught them up, drew their swords, and slaughtered many of them. Then our men crossed the river without hesitation. They advanced on unfavorable ground. The enemy resisted. Battle began again, and again they routed the enemy. Elsewhere, 2 other legions, the 11th and 8th, engaged with the Veromandui and overcame them. They then left the higher ground and began to fight actually on the river bank. Now, although the 12th were on the right flank and the 7th not far off to the front and on the left flank, the camp was almost completely exposed. Under the leadership of their supreme commander, Bodugonatus, the Nervi formed up into a dense compact column and marched upon this part of the camp. Some of them began to encircle the legions on their exposed left flank. The rest made for the higher ground on which the camp stood. I think we're almost there. Yep. Hmm. 24. I mentioned earlier that the enemy's first assault had routed our cavalry and the light infantry which had accompanied it. When those forces of ours returned to camp, they ran right up against the enemy advance and again tried to flee elsewhere. From the main entrance gate on the crest of the hill, the orderlies had seen our men cross the river victorious, and had then gone out in search of plunder. But when they saw the enemy moving about in our camp, they took to their heels and fled. At that moment, a roar of confusion went up from the men marching with the baggage train, and frightened soldiers started to flee in all directions. All this served to terrify the cavalry of the Treviri, who had a reputation for outstanding bravery among the Gauls. They had been sent out by their people as reinforcements and had come to Caesar. When, however, they saw the enemy army swarming over our camp, our legions hard-pressed and on the point of being surrounded, our orderlies, cavalry, slingers, and Numidians spread out, scattered, fleeing in all directions. Then they abandoned hope for our cause and made their way home. The Romans were beaten, they announced to their fellow citizens. The Romans were overcome. The Nervi had taken possession of their camp and their baggage. 25. After his words of encouragement to the 10th, Caesar made his way to the right flank. There he saw that his soldiers were hard-pressed. Because their standards were crowded together, the men of the 12th were packed so close that they obstructed one another in the fighting. All the centurions of the 4th cohort were dead. The standard bearers was slain, the standard lost. All but a few centurions from the rest of the cohorts were wounded or dead. Among the casualties was a senior centurion called Publius Sextius Bacillus, a man of immense courage, who was suffering from numerous serious wounds. He could no longer stand upright, and the rest of the men were weakening. Some of those at the rear were leaving the battle and retreating to avoid missiles, while the enemy did not slacken but pressed up the hill in front and continued to attack on both flanks. Caesar realized that outcome rested on a knife edge. There was no hope of reinforcements, so he snatched a shield from one of the soldiers at the rear. He had come out without his own shield, and made his way to the front line. There he called upon the centurions by name and encouraged the men, ordering them to advance in open ranks, so they could use their swords more easily. His coming gave the men fresh hope and heartened them. Each one was eager of his own accord to do well in his commander's sight, even at great personal risk, and the enemy assault was checked a little. 26. Caesar now saw that the 7th Legion too, which had taken up position beside the 12th, was being hard pressed by the enemy. He ordered the military tribunes to close their legions up gradually, wheel about, and attack the enemy. By this means, since they could all support one another and need not fear being attacked by the enemy from behind, they began to resist with greater daring and to fight more bravely. Meanwhile, the soldiers from the 2 legions, which had been at the rear of the column to guard the baggage, heard of the battle. They sped forward and came into enemy view on top of the hill. Titus Labienus, who had taken over the enemy camp and from his vantage saw what was happening in our camp, sent the 10th Legion to our men's assistance. When the men of the 10th discovered from the fleeing cavalry and orderlies that the fighting and the extent of the danger which now threatened the camp, the legions and their commander, they left nothing undone in terms of speed. Hmm. 27. Their arrival transformed our fortunes, so much so that our men, even though those who lay wounded, supported themselves on their shields and began to fight the fight afresh. The orderlies now observed that it was the Nervi who were afraid, and weaponless as they were, they charged upon the armed enemy. So too the cavalry tried to wipe out the shame of its desertion by fighting everywhere in an attempt to outdo the legionaries. The enemy, however, even at this critical moment, showed such determination in their bravery that when those in the front rank had fallen, the men behind them stood upon the slain and continued the fight from on top of their corpses. When they were overthrown, the pile of bodies grew higher, while the survivors used the heap as a vantage point for throwing missiles at our men, or catching their spears and throwing them back. Not without good reason were they judged to be men of enormous bravery, for they had dared to cross a very wide river, climb its steep banks, and advance on extremely difficult ground. The Nervi's courage had made light of these obstacles. 28. When the battle was over, the name and fighting strength of Nervi were almost wiped out. We mentioned earlier that the elders were gathered together in inlets and marshes along with the women and children. When news came of the battle, they assumed that nothing stood in the way of the victors and that for the vanquished nothing was secure. So all the survivors agreed to send envoys to Caesar and surrendered to him. Describing the disaster which had befallen them, the Nervian envoys declared that they had been reduced from 600 senators to 3, from 60,000 men capable of active service to a mere 500. Caesar was eager to preserve their safety and to be seen to exercise clemency towards the wretched people who were pleading with him. He ordered them to confine themselves to their own territories and towns, and commanded their neighbors to refrain from doing the Nervi and their people harm or injury. 29. We described the Aduatuci above. They were on their way to assist the Nervi in full force when the news of the battle made them give up their march and return home. They abandoned all their towns and strongholds and brought all their property to one town, which had superb natural defenses. All along its circumference, it presented sheer cliffs and heights which at one spot left a gently sloping approach, no more than 200 feet wide. This the Aduatuci had strengthened by a high double wall, and were even now putting heavy rocks and sharpened stakes along its length. The Aduatuci were descendants of those Cimbri and Teutoni who, when marching into our province in Italy, had left all the cattle and baggage they could not drive or carry with them on this side of the Rhine. They left a guard, 6,000 of their own men, to protect it. Following the destruction of the main force, these men were harassed by neighboring peoples, sometimes attacking, sometimes defending. Eventually, peace was made by common consent, and they selected this place to settle in. 30. As soon as our army arrived at the Aduatuci began making frequent sallies from the town and skirmishing with our men. Later, when they were shut in by a rampart 4.5 miles in length, with numerous forts along it, they remained in the town. Movable shelters were drawn up on the earthwork built, and when the Aduatuci saw a siege tower constructed in the distance, at first they stood on the wall, mocking and jeering that such a large apparatus was being put together so far off. What hands, what strength were men of such puny stature relying on to move this huge and heavy tower against their wall? For the main part of Gauls are very tall and hold our slighter build in contempt. 31. But when they saw the tower being moved and coming close to the walls, the sight of it was so unusual and unexpected that it prompted them to send envoys to Caesar to ask for peace. The envoys spoke to the effect that in their opinion the Romans had divine help in waging war, to enable them to move with such tall structures forward so quickly, and so they declared they surrendered themselves and all their possessions to Romans' control. They begged and pleaded for only one favor, if perhaps his clemency and mercy, of which they had heard from others, were to prompt Caesar to spare them not to be deprived of their weapons. Almost all their neighbors were hostile and looked on their courage with unfriendly eye. The Aduatuci could not protect themselves against these people without weapons. They would rather endure any fate at the hands of the Roman people if brought to such a pass, than be tortured and killed by peoples among whom they had once reigned supreme. 32. Caesar answered them that he would spare their state, more because this would accord with habitual practice than because of their merit, if they surrendered before the battering ram touched the wall. There could, however, be no formal surrender unless they gave up their weapons. Instead, he would do for them what he had done for the Nervi, and would order the neighboring peoples not to harm subjects of the Roman people. His offer was reported back to the Aduatuci, and they agreed to obey. They threw a large number of weapons down from the wall into the ditch in front of the town. The piles of arms were almost as high as the wall and mound. Even so, it was revealed later that about a third of their weapons had been concealed and kept in town. They opened their gates and for that day enjoyed peace. 33. When night fell, Caesar gave orders for the gates to be closed and the soldiers to leave town, to prevent the soldiers doing the inhabitants any harm by night. But the Aduatuci were acting on a predetermined plan, it seemed, in the belief that after the surrender our men would withdraw their guards, or at least keep watch rather less carefully. They equipped themselves with weapons they had kept concealed, and with shields which, as the pressure of time demanded, were made in haste, of bark or wicker, covered with hides. At the third watch they suddenly burst out of the town in full strength and attacked where the climb up to our defense works was least steep. As Caesar had already ordered, a fire signal was immediately given. Men ran to assemble from the nearest forts. The enemy fought as fiercely as brave men might be expected to when clinging to their last hope of safety, on difficult ground against Romans throwing missiles at them from the rampart and the towers, and when their only hope of survival lay in courage alone. About 4,000 men were killed and the rest forced back into the town. Next day the gates were broken open, for there was no one to defend them. Caesar sent out our soldiers inside, and sold everything in the town in one lot. The buyers reported to him a sale numbering 53,000 people. 34. At the same time, Publius Crassus, whom Caesar had sent with a legion against the Venelli, Asimi, Curiosolidi, Esubi, Aurlursi, and Redones, the coastal states beside the ocean, sent him news that all those states had been brought under the power and dominion of the Roman people. 35. Once this action was over, the whole of Gaul was pacified. The fame of this war spread among the barbarians and was so impressive that the people living on the other side of the Rhine sent envoys to Caesar. They promised to give him hostages and to obey his commands. He was, however, in a hurry to reach Italy and Illyricum, and so told the embassies to return to him at the start of the following summer. Then he took the legions to their winter quarters in the lands of the Carnutes, Andes, and Turones, and the other states near to the area where he had been campaigning. He himself set out for Italy. Because of these achievements reported in a letter from Caesar, a thanksgiving of 15 days was decreed. This had never been granted to anyone before. And that's the end of the second book. So we're about a sixth of the way through, I think. But that's where I'm going to end it today. It's been a little over, just slightly over 2 hours. Actually, almost exactly 2 hours. So it'll probably take, I don't know, 3 or 4 more Mondays of this. Then we pick another book. Did that freeze? Oh well, doesn't matter, you can hear me. And on that note, I'm going to say thanks for watching. I wonder how long ago it froze. Oh well. And I'll see you next time. Next Monday for those who want to... oh, it's just the webcam. I should do it. No? There we go. We fixed? Okay. We're fixed. So, I'll continue reading next Monday, 2 o'clock as 2 o'clock Eastern time as usual. Gaming is whenever I have time during the week and I'm not exhausted from work. Been playing some 7 days. That's fun. So, yeah. Thanks for hanging, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.